My name is Marin, a 48-year-old director of structural engineering, and for the last 18 years, I have been the invisible steel spine holding Apex Structural together, a woman defined by rigid schedules, absolute precision, and a complete lack of patience for anything that defies the laws of physics. Every morning, the rhythm of my life was dictated by the turning of a brass key in a heavy, tempered glass door at exactly 5:45, long before the sun had even hinted at rising over the Seattle skyline to turn the gray waters of the Puget Sound into a sheet of hammered steel. In the high-stakes, high-altitude world of commercial construction, I was what they called a lifer, a term that carried both professional respect and a hint of tragic permanence. My title was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, but the reality of my job was much heavier and far less glamorous than the corporate letterhead suggested. I was the firewall between a beautiful, impossible architectural drawing and the brutal, unforgiving reality of gravity. I was the person who ensured that when the wind howled off the ocean at 80 miles per hour, the concrete didn't crack, the steel didn't buckle, and the people sipping champagne inside remained completely oblivious to the violent forces waging war against their shelter. My office was a sanctuary of calculated precision, a stark, deliberate contrast to the chaotic, open-plan creative studios down the hall where the visionaries worked amidst mood boards and espresso machines. My space smelled faintly of ammonia from fresh blueprints and the sharp metallic tang of stress-tested rebar samples that lined my shelves like trophies of wars won against nature. I loved the quiet of the early morning because it was the only time the world made sense before the chaos of the day, before the budget cuts, before the compromises, and before the egos arrived to dismantle logic. We were merely weeks away from breaking ground on the Skyline Resort, an $80 million project perched precariously on a jagged coastal cliff that jutted out into the Pacific like a defiant chin. It was a beast of a project, a logistical nightmare requiring surgical precision to anchor it into the unstable bedrock, and I had spent the better part of a year fighting with the geology, running simulations until my eyes burned to ensure it would stand for a century. The silence of my sanctuary was shattered at exactly 7:30, interrupting the low, steady hum of the HVAC system. The conference room door didn't just open, it slammed against the rubber stopper, vibrating with the force of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. Kyler walked in. The 24-year-old son of our retired founder, Kyler was currently masquerading as our creative director, a position he had inherited along with his trust fund and a dangerous lack of imposter syndrome. He brought with him a suffocating cloud of designer cologne, something musky and overpriced that lingered in the air like a bad decision, and the frantic, manic energy of someone who mistook hallucination for inspiration. He was dressed for a Fashion Week after-party, not a construction briefing, wearing a midnight blue velvet blazer that cost more than the annual safety equipment budget for our entire site crew. He bypassed the customary morning greetings, completely ignoring the 3 senior PhD-level engineers sitting at the table, men and women who had built bridges and dams and tossed a leather portfolio onto the mahogany surface with a dramatic thud. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and gleaming with a dangerous kind of excitement that suggested he hadn't slept, fueled by double espressos and delusions of grandeur. He announced, breathless, that he had experienced a creative epiphany at 3 a.m, a vision that rendered our current plans obsolete. With a flourish that he must have practiced in the mirror, he unrolled a new sketch over my carefully plotted schematics. It was a disaster. It was the Skyline Resort, but stripped of every structural redundancy I had calculated. He had erased the steel sheer walls, the very spine of the building, and replaced them with vast, unsupported spans of glass. He wanted a floating aesthetic, a building that looked like it was defying gravity, unaware that gravity is a patient adversary that always wins eventually. I sat motionless, my spine pressing against the mesh of my ergonomic chair, watching him pace the room like a predatory cat in a cage that was too small for its ego. He spoke in a rapid-fire dialect of corporate buzzwords: synergy, disruption, organic transparency, democratizing the view, while completely ignoring the seismic reality of the Pacific Northwest. He talked about opening the space to the elements, which, in engineering terms, is synonymous with inviting a catastrophe. When he finally stopped to inhale, waiting for us to applaud his genius, I spoke. My voice was low, controlled, and devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used when explaining to a contractor why they couldn't use wet lumber, a voice that brokered no argument. I explained that his design was visually striking in a theoretical sense, but structurally suicidal in a practical one. I listed the specific building codes his drawing violated: wind load distribution, seismic drift limits, and thermal efficiency requirements. I pointed out that glass, no matter how strong, does not behave like steel in an earthquake. It does not bend, it shatters. I expected a debate. I expected him to push back with logic, or perhaps ask how we could compromise to achieve a similar look. Instead, he reached for the whiteboard markers. The sound of the plastic cap popping off was sharp in the silent room, like a pistol slide racking. He walked over to the blueprints I had spent months perfecting, the ones pinned to the wall that detailed the load paths, and he began to desecrate them. The red ink bled into the white paper as he slashed through my columns and crossed out my load calculations with violent X's. He called my engineering cowardly. He said I was designing a prison, not a palace. He told me that he was tired of the old guard stifling his innovation with our obsession with safety, spitting the word safety like it was an insult to his artistic integrity. The room felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out. The other engineers looked at me, terror in their eyes, silently pleading with me not to escalate the situation, knowing that Kyler held the keys to their employment and their mortgages. Kyler turned to me, the red marker still in his hand like a weapon, and issued his decree. He wanted the steel gone. He wanted structural glass, and he wanted it cheap. He laughed when I mentioned the budget, claiming he had found a disruptor in the supply chain who could provide the materials for a third of the cost I had quoted. That was the moment the cold knot of dread formed in my stomach, turning into absolute ice. In construction, cheap and structural are mutually exclusive terms. You can have cheap, or you can have structural, but you cannot have both. If you find cheap structural glass, you haven't found a deal. You've found a defect. I asked him for the name of this supplier, keeping my face neutral to mask the rising panic. He waved me off, telling me it was already handled, that the purchase order was signed, and that I needed to get with the program or get out of his way. He stormed out of the room, leaving the scent of musk and the visual ruin of my work behind him, the red ink dripping metaphorically down the walls of my career. I didn't waste time venting to my colleagues. Panic is contagious, and I needed clarity, not commiseration. I went straight to my desk and locked the door. I accessed the internal procurement server using my administrative privileges, a remnant of the days when the founder trusted me to audit the books before his son took over. I searched for the new vendor. I found Kyler's purchase order immediately, glowing on the screen like a radioactive warning. It had been rubber-stamped at 6:45 a.m. by Derek, our CFO, a man whose greed was only matched by his ignorance of engineering principles. I opened the technical specifications for the glass they had ordered. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the data sheets. It was listed as Class B tempered glass from a manufacturer I had never heard of, based in a jurisdiction with notoriously loose quality regulations. Class B is fine for a coffee table. It is fine for a shower door. It is absolutely criminal to use it as a load-bearing facade on a high-rise building facing the ocean. It lacked the necessary tensile strength and thermal flexibility. It was prone to nickel sulfide inclusions, microscopic impurities that can cause the glass to spontaneously shatter when heated by the sun. If installed, it wouldn't just fail, it would be a time bomb waiting for a hot day or a strong gust of wind. I sat there in the glow of my monitor, realizing I had reached the crossroads of my career. I could stay silent, collect my six-figure salary, and pray the building didn't kill anyone, effectively becoming an accomplice to potential manslaughter. Or I could burn my career down to save the project. I chose the latter. I printed the purchase order. I printed the specs. And then I drafted a document that no one in the company had seen in a decade, a notice of non-compliance. This wasn't a standard memo, it was a legal shield. I detailed exactly why the material was unsafe, citing the specific statutes of the building code and the ASTM standards. I walked down the hall to Kyler's office. He was lounging in his Herman Miller chair, scrolling through social media, his feet on the desk. I placed the paper on his desk, right over his phone. I told him, with absolute clarity, that I would not authorize this material change unless he signed this document, acknowledging that he was overriding the Director of Engineering's safety refusal. I told him I needed him to take full personal liability for any failure. He didn't even read it. To him, it was just another piece of bureaucratic toilet paper, another attempt by me to be difficult. He signed it with a flourish, sneering at me, calling me a bureaucrat who was afraid of progress. He thought he was exerting dominance. He didn't realize he was signing his own confession, documenting his negligence in black ink. I took the document back to my office, scanned it to my private, encrypted cloud storage, and locked the original in my fireproof safe. I knew my time was short. Men like Kyler don't like having their authority challenged, and men like Derek don't like having their paper trails examined. 3 days later, the axe fell. I arrived at work to find my access badge deactivated. The little red light on the card reader blinked at me, a digital middle finger. Sam, the security guard I had known for 15 years, looked like he wanted to cry as he escorted me to HR. He apologized under his breath, telling me he had no choice. Derek was there in the HR office, looking smug and polished, smelling of breath mints and deceit. He handed me a termination letter that cited insubordination and failure to adapt to company vision. He smirked as he told me that they were pivoting to a younger, more agile leadership team. He leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and threatened me with a lawsuit if I breathed a word of this to the clients or the press. He thought he held all the cards. He thought that by firing me, he was cutting out the cancer. He forgot that I wasn't the cancer. I was the heart. I packed my box in silence. I took my degree. I took my photos of the bridges I had built. And then, I reached into my desk drawer and took out my state licensing stamp. The heavy, embossed steel seal that legitimized every blueprint the company produced. I held it for a moment, feeling the cold metal. This was the source of their power, and they didn't even know it. I put it in my pocket. As I walked out, Kyler stood in his doorway, sipping coffee from a mug that said "Boss," watching me leave with a look of supreme satisfaction. He called out, asking if I needed help carrying my box to the car, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me for the last time. He didn't know. He genuinely didn't know. In our state, a construction company is not a person. It cannot hold a professional license. It must have a qualifying party, a human being with the requisite education and experience who legally lends their license to the corporation. For 12 years, that human being was me. The company's ability to pull permits, to bid on contracts, to legally exist as a contractor was entirely dependent on my name being attached to their file at the state board. They thought the license belonged to the company, like the desks or the computers. They were wrong. It belonged to me. It was my intellectual property. I sat in my car in the parking lot, the rain starting to drizzle against the windshield, blurring the view of the building I had helped build. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and called the state contractors board. I navigated the automated menu until I reached the option for disassociation of qualifying party. I spoke to the clerk, my voice steady, giving my license number and the company ID. I formally removed my name from Apex Structural's license, effective immediately. The clerk warned me that this would trigger an automatic suspension of the company's license. I told her I understood. I hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the decision settle over me. I didn't go home. I drove to a cafe overlooking the Skyline Resort construction site. I ordered a black coffee and watched. It took 45 minutes for the system to catch up. The site was a hive of activity, cranes spinning, trucks reversing, jackhammers pounding, the symphony of progress. And then, the digital notification hit the city's system. I saw the foreman, Elias, a good man with 3 kids, answer his phone. I saw his shoulders slump. He blew a whistle, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the noise. The work stopped. The cranes froze mid-rotation. The engines died. The silence that descended on the site was absolute. It was the sound of a legal guillotine dropping. Without a qualifier, they were no longer a licensed contractor. Every second they continued to work was a criminal offense. I watched as the confusing scene unfolded, workers gathering in huddles, pointing at the locked gates where the city inspectors were already arriving with red tags. But the chaos was just beginning. The second domino was financial, and it was going to hit harder. Construction loans are released in draws based on certified progress. The bank requires the engineer of record to sign off on every milestone before releasing the cash. That engineer was me. With me gone and the license suspended, the bank's risk algorithm would scream. The $10 million draw they were expecting on Friday to pay for Kyler's glass and the crew's wages? It was frozen. Derek had likely already spent the company's operating cash on the down payment for the glass, banking on that draw to refill the coffers. Now, the well was dry. By the next afternoon, the desperation had set in. Elias called me, his voice trembling. He told me that Kyler had ordered a skeleton crew to work illegally through the night. They were trying to install the first panels of the new glass facade to show visible progress to the investors, hoping to bypass the bank's freeze by proving work was continuing. They rushed the installation. They ignored the thermal expansion gaps I had specified for the steel frame, bolting the cheap glass rigidly into place under the direct sunlight. It happened at noon, Marin, Elias said, his voice cracking. When the sun hit the peak, the physics were inescapable. The dark steel frame heated up in the midday sun, the cheap glass expanded, the bolts didn't give. The tension built up until the molecular structure couldn't hold. Elias described it as a gunshot. A massive pane of glass on the fourth floor exploded outward, showering the street below with razor-sharp shards. It destroyed a parked car, slicing through the convertible top like butter. A piece of glass the size of a butcher knife embedded itself in the asphalt, inches from where a city inspector was standing. I turned on the news. I saw Kyler trying to hide his face from the cameras, his velvet blazer looking ridiculous and tragic amidst the flashing lights of police cruisers. The site was wrapped in yellow caution tape. The reporter was talking about gross negligence and endangerment. I watched, feeling no joy, only a cold, hard resolution. They had wanted to cut costs. They had wanted to ignore the laws of physics. Now, the physics were fighting back. But I wasn't done. The glass was just the beginning. I opened my laptop and composed an email to the vice president of the hotel group, our biggest client. I attached the notice of non-compliance with Kyler's signature. I attached the purchase order for the cheap glass. And I attached my termination letter. I wrote a simple message. As the former engineer of record, I am duty-bound to inform you that unauthorized, non-compliant materials have been installed on your property, creating an immediate structural hazard. I hit send. I stood up and put on my coat. I wasn't Marin, the fired employee, anymore. I was Marin, the independent expert. My phone rang. It was the client's legal team. They wanted to hire me. They wanted me to go back to the site. Not as a worker, but as the owner's representative, the person with the power to tear it all down. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots. Kyler had wanted to run the show. I was about to show him exactly what happens when the curtain falls. The drive back to the Apex Structural Headquarters was perhaps the longest 30 minutes of my entire life, a span of time that felt stretched thin by the suffocating weight of anticipation. I was no longer navigating the rainy streets in my sensible commuter sedan. Instead, I was seated in the back of a black town car sent by the hotel group, a heavy leather binder resting on my lap like a loaded weapon. The rain had intensified, washing over Seattle in relentless gray sheets, turning the world outside the tinted windows into a blurred watercolor of regret and looming consequences. My phone remained silent in my pocket, not because people weren't trying to reach me. I knew the notifications were piling up like storm debris, but because I had turned it off. I needed absolute clarity, the kind of mental silence that allows a structural engineer to calculate the collapse of a building before the first crack even appears on the surface. When the car finally pulled up to the glass-fronted building where I had spent 18 years of my career, I felt a strange, chilling sense of detachment. It was as if I were visiting a museum dedicated to a civilization that had already perished. Observing the ruins before the archaeologists had even arrived, I walked through the lobby, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished terrazzo, and the atmosphere was thick with a palpable tension, the kind of electrified air that precedes a violent thunderstorm. Sam, the security guard who had escorted me out with eyes full of pity just days before, stood up abruptly as I approached. His hand instinctively reached for the gate release, but his face was a mask of confusion as he saw the two high-powered corporate attorneys flanking me. I didn't stop to explain. I simply offered him a brief nod, a small gesture of recognition for the only person in this building who had done his job with integrity while the leadership rotted from the head down. We took the elevator to the executive floor, the silence inside the metal box amplified by the soft, indifferent hum of the cables, counting down the floors to the boardroom where the emergency meeting was already underway. Even through the soundproofing of the executive suite, I could hear Kyler's voice before the doors even opened. It was shrill, defensive, and pitched an octave too high, penetrating the heavy oak veneer. He was shouting about force majeure, unforeseen atmospheric anomalies, and vendor betrayal, trying to use big, complex words to cover up small, petty crimes. The lawyer beside me, Mr. Sterling, a man who possessed the predatory calmness of a shark in deep water, pushed the double doors open without knocking. The sound of Kyler's desperate monologue was cut short instantly, as if someone had severed the audio cable to a speaker. The scene inside the boardroom was a tableau of corporate disaster. The long mahogany table, usually pristine, was littered with half-empty water bottles, disorganized stacks of paper, and tablets displaying plummeting graphs. Kyler stood at the head of the table, his signature velvet blazer rumpled, his hair a chaotic mess, looking less like a visionary and more like a child who had been caught playing with matches while the house burned down around him. Derek, the chief financial officer, sat to his right, his face ashen and slick with sweat, furiously tapping on a laptop as if he could delete the reality of the situation with a few frantic keystrokes. Across from them sat the representatives of the hotel group Miss Vance and her team, three individuals in charcoal suits who looked less like clients and more like executioners, waiting for the signal to drop the blade. Kyler stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in a caricature of shock as he saw me enter. His eyes darted frantically between me and the lawyers, his brain struggling to process the impossibility of my presence. "What is she doing here?" Kyler demanded, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Security! I want her removed. She is a disgruntled former employee trespassing on private property. This is a confidential board meeting." Mr. Sterling didn't even look at Kyler. He simply walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the position of power pulled it out for me, and then remained standing like a sentinel. "Marin is not trespassing, Mr. Morrison," Sterling said, his voice smooth, cold, and carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "She is here as the designated owner's representative for the hotel group. As of 9 a.m. this morning, she holds full power of attorney regarding the Skyline Resort project. She is your supervisor, Kyler. And frankly, she is the only reason we haven't called the district attorney yet." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room, leaving Kyler gasping for air. I didn't look at Kyler. I sat down, opened my binder with a deliberate slowness, and placed my hands on the table, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingertips. "Sit down, Kyler," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority, the same voice I used to command a construction site of 200 men. "We have a lot of structural damage to assess, and very little time to do it." Kyler sank into his chair, not because he wanted to comply, but because his legs seemed to give out beneath him. He looked small, defeated, the grandeur of his vision shrinking in the face of competence. "You can't do this," Derek hissed, leaning forward, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "This is a conflict of interest. She has a vendetta against this company. She's biased." I turned my gaze to Derek, looking at him with the clinical detachment of a biologist, examining a specimen under a microscope. "My only interest is physics, Derek," I replied calmly. "And physics doesn't have vendettas, it only has consequences. Gravity doesn't care about your quarterly bonus, and wind shear doesn't care about my employment status. Now, let's discuss the glass." I opened the binder to the first tab, the sound of the metal rings snapping open echoing in the quiet room, and slid a copy of the Notice of Non-Compliance across the table toward the client representatives. "This document," I began, addressing the hotel group executives while keeping Kyler in my peripheral vision, "was presented to the creative director 3 days before my termination. It details the specific code violations inherent in the material substitution he authorized. I watched as Miss Vance picked up the paper and read it, her eyes narrowing as she reached the bottom of the page where the ink was darkest. "And this is your signature, Kyler?" "Miss," Vance asked, holding the paper up, the black ink of his arrogant, flourishing scrawl visible to everyone in the room. Kyler stammered, his face flushing a deep, blotchy red. I signed a lot of paperwork. Marin is bureaucratic. She tries to slow us down with red tape. I didn't read every line. I didn't know she was documenting it for this," I interjected gently. "You signed a liability waiver, Kyler. You accepted full personal and professional responsibility for the structural integrity of the Class B glass. You overruled the engineer of record. That is not bureaucracy. That is negligence. And by signing that, you legally absolved the engineering department and me of any fault in yesterday's failure." Derek tried to intervene, sensing the walls closing in on his own involvement. "Look, let's not get bogged down in paperwork. The glass failing was a freak accident, a manufacturing defect, the vendor assured us." "The vendor, Mr." Sterling interrupted, placing a thick forensic accounting report on the table next to my engineering documents, "is a shell company registered in Nevada, with no physical office, no factory, and no employees." Derek went pale, his mouth snapping shut audibly. "We ran a background check on the vendor immediately after Marin contacted us," Sterling continued, his voice relentless. "It turns out, the vendor has a singular connection, a business checking account that received a transfer from Apex Structural and then immediately wired 15% of that sum to a private LLC held by one Derek Miller." The room went deadly quiet again. But this time, the quality of the silence was different. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was judgment. It was the sound of a career ending. All eyes turned to Derek, who was now trembling visibly, his hands shaking so hard he had to clasp them together on the table to stop the vibration. That's a consulting fee," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible, a pathetic attempt to reframe reality, "for logistics, expediting fees." "It's a kickback, Derek," I said, stating the fact without anger, just a simple observation of data. "You bought substandard glass that endangers human life, so you could pocket the difference. You compromised the structural integrity of an $80 million asset for a quick payout. You didn't just cut corners. You sold the safety of future guests for a down payment on a boat." Kyler looked at Derek, genuine shock on his face. He had been incompetent and arrogant, yes, but he had been too stupid to realize his partner was a criminal. "You told me it was a discount," Kyler said, his voice sounding small and childlike. "You told me we were saving the company money. You said it was a strategic sourcing win." "I was trying to save us," Derek shouted, finally snapping, standing up and knocking his chair over. "The margins were too thin. Your vision was bleeding us dry, Kyler. We needed cash flow. Or we weren't going to make payroll next month. I kept the lights on while you played architect. So you decided to defraud the client and endanger the public," Miss Vance said, her voice icy and final. "Mr. Sterling, please ensure the police are waiting downstairs. We are pressing charges for fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment." Derek slumped back against the wall, defeated, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, realizing that his greed had built a cage he couldn't buy his way out of. But we weren't finished. The structural failure was systemic, and the rot started at the head. The boardroom doors opened again, and this time there was no slamming, just the slow, heavy creak of hinges turning. The founder walked in. He looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him at the company picnic. His posture was stooped, he walked with a cane, and his face was a mask of weary resignation. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at the lawyers. His eyes were fixed entirely on his son. Kyler stood up, hope flickering in his eyes for a brief second, the instinct of a child looking for a parent to fix a broken toy. "Dad, you have to tell them. Tell them about the vision. Tell them I was just trying to modernize. Tell them they can't do this." The founder stopped at the end of the table and looked at Kyler with a profound, crushing disappointment that was far worse than any anger could have been. It was the look of a man watching his legacy turn to ash. "I built this company with a shovel and a handshake," the founder said, his voice raspy but clear. "I built it on the promise that when we put a roof over someone's head, it stays there. I trusted you with the only thing that mattered, our name. And in 6 months, you turned my legacy into a crime scene. I can fix it, Kyler pleaded, tears streaming down his face now, ruining the velvet of his blazer, turning the fabric dark. Just give me another chance, I'll hire Marin back. We'll fix the glass. I'll listen this time. You can't hire me back, I said softly from my seat. I don't work for Apex anymore. And neither do you, Kyler. Because Apex doesn't exist anymore. The founder nodded slowly, acknowledging my words. I've just come from a meeting with the bank and the bonding company, he said. They've called in our loans. The insurance carrier has voided our liability policies due to gross negligence and fraud. We are insolvent. The company is finished. Kyler looked around the room, panic rising in his chest as he realized the safety net of his inheritance was being cut away. What does that mean? Kyler asked, his voice trembling. It means it's over, the founder said, turning his back on his son. To avoid criminal prosecution for the corporation itself, I have agreed to a full liquidation of assets to repay the hotel group for the damages and the breach of contract. Apex Structural ceases operations effective immediately. Security will escort you out. Kyler collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing loudly, a sound that was uncomfortable and pathetic in the sterile boardroom. I watched him, feeling no triumph, no surge of victory, only a quiet sense of closure. The physics of his actions had finally caught up with him. Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. He had pushed against reality, and reality had pushed back, harder. The next few months were a blur of legal proceedings, auctions, and reconstruction, a process that was as painful as it was necessary. I spent my days at the site, not as a director, but as the owner of my own newly formed consultancy firm, hired directly by the hotel group to oversee the remediation. We had to strip the building down to its bones, removing every jagged shard of Kyler's vanity project. It was satisfying work, peeling away the fraud to reveal the honest steel beneath, grinding away the mistakes until we reached a solid foundation. I hired Elias and his crew back on day one. They were good men who had been led by fools, and they worked with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that safety was once again the priority. We found more problems as we dug corners cut on the HVAC system, insufficient fireproofing on the third floor, missing rebar in the retention walls, all legacies of Derek's cost-cutting measures. Every time we found a flaw, I documented it, fixed it, and signed off on it with my stamp, the stamp that Kyler had tried to render obsolete. The liquidation of Apex Structural was swift and brutal. The office furniture, the high-end computers, the company vehicles, and the intellectual property were sold off to the highest bidder to pay the creditors. I attended the auction for the technical equipment, standing in the back of the warehouse where I had spent nearly 2 decades of my life. The air smelled of dust and failure. I watched as strangers bid on the tools of our trade. I raised my paddle only twice. I bought my old desk solid oak, scratched from years of drafting, and I bought the large format plotter printer that Kyler had claimed was too loud and had tried to replace with a digital screen. It was a good machine, reliable and precise, and it deserved a better home. I saw Kyler once during the proceedings, standing near the back, watching his custom ergonomic chair being sold for a fraction of its cost. He wasn't wearing velvet anymore. He was wearing a generic windbreaker and jeans, looking smaller, stripped of the armor of his father's money. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge me, and I felt no need to bridge the gap. His lesson was his to learn. Derek pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would spend the next 5 years in a minimum security facility, thinking about the margins he had tried to manipulate. The founder sold his vineyard and his estate to cover the remaining debts that the company assets couldn't satisfy, retiring to a small condo in Arizona, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale taught in business ethics classes. 6 months later, the Skyline Resort finally opened. It didn't have floating glass walkways or invisible supports. It had robust architectural steel columns that framed the ocean view with strength and dignity. It was a building that respected the wind rather than trying to ignore it. The aesthetic was powerful, grounded, and safe. I stood on the terrace during the opening gala, holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs below. The wind was blowing hard, a typical Pacific storm rolling in, but the glass walls held firm. They didn't rattle, they didn't bow, they simply existed, doing exactly what I had calculated them to do. Miss Vance, the executive from the hotel group, walked up to me and clinked her glass against mine. "It feels solid," she said, looking out at the storm raging against the reinforced glass. "It is," I replied. "It's built to stand." She smiled, turning to face me. "You know, Marin, we have 3 other properties entering the development phase next year. One in Tokyo, one in Dubai. We're looking for a firm to handle the structural oversight. We need someone who knows how to say no. Are you interested?" I looked at her, thinking about my new office, the small team I had started to build, the way Elias whistled when he worked because he knew he was safe. "I'll send you a proposal on Monday," I said. As I left the gala, wrapping my coat tighter against the chill, I walked down to the valet stand to retrieve my car. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the lights of the hotel I had saved. The valet attendant jogged over to me, keeping his head down, focused on the ticket in his hand. "Ticket number 42? He asked, his voice familiar, though stripped of its former cadence. I looked up. It was Kyler. He looked older, tired. The manic energy was gone, replaced by the dull exhaustion of someone working a double shift on their feet. He froze when he saw me, his hand hovering over the key rack. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, filled with the history of the company he had destroyed and the building I had rebuilt. He didn't sneer, and he didn't try to make a joke. He just looked ashamed. "I'll get your car, Marin," he said quietly, looking at his shoes. He jogged off to the lot, and I watched him go, feeling a strange sense of pity. He had wanted to be a leader, but he had never learned that leadership isn't about the title on the door, it's about the weight you carry for others. He returned with my car, parking it carefully, ensuring he didn't scratch the rims, a detail he would have never noticed a year ago. He opened the door for me, a humble gesture that felt foreign coming from him. I reached into my purse and pulled out a $20 bill. I held it out to him. He hesitated, his pride warring with his reality. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw clarity there. He took the money. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching the bill. "Drive safe, Kyler," I said. I got into my car and pulled away, watching him in the rearview mirror as he stood under the awning, a small figure against the massive, unshakable structure of the hotel. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate requires energy, and I had better things to do with my energy, like calculating load paths and ensuring stability. As I merged onto the highway, heading toward my own office, I thought about the red marker he had used to cross out my work. He had tried to erase the rules, thinking they were obstacles to his freedom. But rules, in engineering and in life, are not obstacles. They are the only things that keep the roof from caving in. Competence isn't flashy. It doesn't scream for attention, and it doesn't wear velvet blazers. But when the storm comes, when the wind howls and the ground shakes, competence is the only thing left standing. And as I drove through the night, the city lights blurring past me, I knew that I was exactly where I belonged. Firmly grounded in reality, building a future that would last. Real power isn't about who shouts the loudest in the boardroom, it's about who holds the keys when the lock breaks. My silence wasn't weakness, it was a strategic pause that allowed incompetence to shatter under its own weight. If you have ever had to quietly pack a box and walk away from a place that didn't value you, trusting that the truth would eventually surface, know that you are not alone. Integrity always plays the long game. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their competence is their strongest weapon.